Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining us today and welcome. My name is Holly Peterson. I'm a neuroresource facilitator here with the Brain Injury Alliance of Iowa in our Iowa City office. And today I'm going to be talking about grief and loss and how it affects family and caregivers. A couple quick things before we get started. Just so you know, at the end of the presentation, you will be getting an email with a certificate of attendance and a short survey about the webinar. There are no CEUs offered for this presentation, but you will get that certificate of attendance. And please feel free to comment or put questions in the question area. We will have plenty of time at the end to discuss questions. Okay, so today we will be defining grief, disenfranchised grief, and ambiguous loss. We will also be identifying losses in relation to brain injury and how those affect the individual as the survivor, but also how it affects the caregiver and how it affects the family as a whole. And finally, we'll be discussing strains and gains, of caregiving. So this isn't an easy topic for everyone. It's one that is not discussed super frequently. Some people have more knowledge and are more comfortable with this topic, but it's certainly normal to have some anxieties and reservations on this topic. It's not an easy one to discuss, but I do feel like it is an important one. So first I'm going to go ahead and define what is grief. Grief is an internal reaction to a loss. Grief is most often associated with death of a loved one, but it's important to recognize that grief arises whenever a desired object is removed from one's life. So simply put, grief follows any form of loss. Grief may involve reactions such as depression, which can occur simultaneously with symptoms, including changes in sleep patterns, crying, weight loss or gain, etc. Grief is a very complicated emotion and can be multidimensional. It can invoke feelings of sadness, confusion, anger, shock, and guilt. It is common for individuals to experience conflicting feelings as well, such as love and hate or joy and despair. Oftentimes, grief is experienced in private. It's very easily hidden and only recognizable when a person chooses to share their thoughts and feelings. And the grieving process is very different for each individual, varies widely from case to case, but everyone grieves. There's no way around it. The only way to get through grief is to go through it. So mourning is the external reaction. It's the part that we can see, such as tears, crying, and following brain injury. The mourning process can sometimes be referred to as mobile mourning. And this term really tries to symbolize the fact that mourning isn't something that just occurs in one period of time or in one stage. Brain injury is one of those things that you may mourn at many different periods of time when new changes arise and when your family's dealing with different challenges as they come up. And it usually occurs more after the shock phase. When you're in crisis mode, you're in survival mode, and you don't really take the time to sit back and really listen to yourself and feel what's going on inside. Now, while everyone does grieve, not everybody will mourn. There are some people who just grow up being taught that mourning's not okay, it's not okay to cry, you shouldn't have any type of public display of things that upset you. And there are some people who just don't know how to mourn. And with brain injury, there's not necessarily a setting in which mourning is considered to be appropriate. When we lose a loved one and we have someone who dies, there's a funeral. There's a symbolic moment where people come and they can grieve and they can mourn, and that's considered to be very appropriate. With brain injury, there isn't a setting like that, so it's very unique in the mourning process. And there are some implications of not mourning. It could cause complicated grief, which we'll discuss further later on in the presentation. It could also be teaching the next generation that it's not okay to mourn and to discuss feelings. So following brain injury, there's a lot of different types of losses that we see. There are losses for the individual, such as lost sense of self, physical challenges, mental, a lot of different changes. And the same goes for family members and family systems. You have a lot of role changes, and we'll talk more about those in depth as we go. So for physical losses, a person with a brain injury, depending on their type of brain injury severity, they may or may not have some physical losses, including walking, talking, eating, physical pain. I think we all are pretty aware of that. What is less widely accepted is that caregivers are also going through physical changes and physical loss. Bereavement is one of those things that it naturally results in physical discomfort. The body is responding to stress. When anyone is stressed, they are actually more likely to be dehydrated. So that's one physical example of how someone who is caregiving for a loved one may have a physical form of change. There are obviously a lot of emotional losses and changes as well. For the person with a brain injury, losses in personality, loss of independence, anger, depression. Caregivers also feel that. There's a stage of shock, and then there's a lot of different feelings that come with that. Sadness, confusion, anger, guilt. There's also social changes and loss. Oftentimes after a crisis, there's a lot of people who come together and rally around a family, but as time goes on, there's less and less of that support and less emotional support. And for a caregiver who is highly involved with their loved one, may not have the time or the desire to uphold social needs that were once there, whether it was going to lunch with friends, going to church, things that all changes with brain injury as well. There's spiritual losses as well. Many survivors and caregivers question, why did this happen to us? And there are a lot of different feelings that come with that. And certainly lost sense of self, lost sense of security, lost meaning, everything changes. And especially in that moment of shock, there's not a lot of answers. There are some predictors of grief that may be signs that grief may be more complicated or may lead into depression. These are some of the predictors of grief. Nature of the relationship. What was your relationship like before the brain injury? If you were very close or you were very distant, a lot of different things can affect that. Time of injury, where was your family at in the life cycle? Do you have young children and now you're responsible not only for caring for them, but also for caring for a spouse or a parent, another loved one? Time of injury can certainly affect how one grieves. Severity of the injury certainly affects one's grieving process. Financial concerns. If the breadwinner of the family is severely injured and no longer able to go back to work, that's a huge, huge financial stressor for the one who is going to be taking on that role. And not just the fact of, where are we going to get money, but if you have someone who balances the checkbook and now they're no longer able to do that, there's a lot of different changes that come into that and all affect how you grieve and what that process looks like. Location of care. If you're caring for your loved one in your own home versus needing them to be in a placement that's out of state, that's going to affect stress levels and how one is dealing with all the changes. Support systems, history of past losses and caregiving experiences. If you cared for an elderly family member, the caregiving could be very different. It could be very similar, but regardless, it can affect how this next caregiving experience affects your life based on that past experience. Culture and religion also play a big part in how one grieves. Unresolved family issues, kind of with the nature of your relationship, that can all affect how one grieves. And there are many other things that factor into how someone deals with such a significant loss. So with the focus on caregivers from a clinical standpoint has mostly focused on these things here. Burden, depression, stress, anxiety. Those are the things that caregivers are most likely and most often report. So it's easy to focus on those things. It's very easy to associate feelings of grief and loss with some of these other buzzwords. Grief and loss is stressful. It is anxiety provoking. So it's not that these feelings aren't accurate, but sometimes grief and loss is overlooked as that is really what you're feeling. Yes, you might have some depression, anxiety, stress, whatever it might be, but that is all in part of grief and loss. And I think it's important to recognize that and to be aware of that. So obviously, based on everything up until now and obviously your own experiences, grief is important because it affects your everyday life and affects your life as a caregiver. It affects your loved one who you're caring for, other family members that are certainly affected, role changes and changes in the family system. So these are all reasons why talking about grief and recognizing it is very important. And it's an intense period of time. It's an intense emotional suffering, and that can lead into sorrow and depression, and go somewhere that's a lot harder to get out of if it's not dealt with. So ambiguous loss is another term that you may hear when talking about grief and loss. The big difference here is that ambiguous loss is very confusing and very hard to understand. It's an undefined loss. It's uncertain. It's not like, there's a lot of different forms of ambiguous loss, but for a brain injury, in this case, the survivor is physically present. They haven't died, but psychologically they have changed. And that is what ambiguous loss represents. They're physically present, but psychologically altered. Aspects of their personality and identity prior to the injury are gone. Those are big losses. Psychological absence is very confusing because the relationship that you once shared appears to be missing or slowly slipping away. Survivors also have to deal with these feelings of loss of their previous relationships and a lost sense of self. And all of these things are what would be referred to as ambiguous loss. And so I just wanted to put this little snippet up explaining it. It says, loss is a reminder that life is not always kind or fair. Tragedy can strike any family at any time. Following a TBI, family members find themselves in a bad situation of which they have no control and many unanswered questions. Survivors, caregivers, and other family members must face many uncertainties. The uncertainties are what is ambiguous loss. They have to face many uncertainties and continual changes that accompany ambiguous loss. These losses continue for a long time and are recognized by few outside of the family system. So in its ambiguous nature and its confusing nature, its undefined nature, it's very hard for someone who's not living it to understand those losses that you're going through. I hear a lot from folks that they get these reactions like, well, your loved one didn't die. Shouldn't you be happy? They're still here. They didn't die. And it's like, well, yes, it's okay to be happy on that part, but it's also okay to grieve the losses that you are feeling and the changes that you are dealing with. And that brings us into what is socially appropriate but in relation to grief. Like I mentioned earlier, when there's a death, you have a funeral, you have a setting that is specifically for grieving and mourning. And you don't have that with brain injury or many ambiguous losses. There's no setting that is deemed appropriate. There's no timing that is deemed appropriate. You just kind of have to figure it out, and it's hard for other people to understand. But again, grief happens and loss happens whenever a desired object is removed from your life. So whether it's a divorce, a fire, another traumatic situation, these are all feelings that are going to be invoked and that are related to grief. And again, you may have people who rally around you during that crisis stage, and then that tends to fade off as time goes on. And disenfranchised grief is the term that is used that's discussing grief that's not widely recognized by society. So again, these are the losses that people can't see, the losses that aren't definite. Those are hard for society to understand. And again, that sense of, well, you should feel lucky, you should feel blessed, you should be happy that they didn't die. With this type of grief, well, with any grief, really, it goes in stages. When you have that initial shock and you're in crisis mode, you're really in survival mode, and it's hard to really sit with your feelings. But it's all a cycle. So you get through the shock phase and then you hit reality. And then you're still kind of in survivor mode because you're like, all right, well, we're getting out of the hospital, and what do we need? What services do we need? What do we need to get set up with? How are we going to get this all going? And then you have time to react, and you have time to be angry and to really sit with what these changes mean to your everyday life and how it affects your family as a whole. And then you integrate. You try to find a new normal. And eventually you get to life function. But it doesn't end there. The reason it's a cycle is because it's a cycle that continues throughout life. So every time something happens, whether it's a holiday, an anniversary, a big milestone in life, things may be different than they would have prior to the injury. And so you're going through those feelings of grief again. You're going through these stages again, and you're cycling through again with all of that grief. So again, it's a lifelong process. Grief is, and it's a continual, it's a process to get through it. And you can move back and forth, and you don't have to hit every stage every time or everything on the cycle. But it does follow you through the lifespan, and that's why it's so important to talk about and so important to deal with and get those supports lined up in life. And again, like anything, everyone's situation is unique. Everyone's coping abilities will be unique to them. So this is a lot of words, but I thought it was important to differentiate between grief and depression. Um, Grief is something typically that, even though you may cycle through it, even though there are aspects of grief throughout the lifespan, it's usually something that you're able to live with, and you're able to have moments of happiness and joy where you're not worrying or feeling sad constantly. So usually with grief, you're able to accept assistance from others. You can acknowledge that you're grieving, that you need support, that you need comfort. It may not be easy to ask for those things, but at some level, you're able to acknowledge that. You can identify your losses. It's okay to be angry about them. It's okay to be sad about them, but it's a little more awareness as to what those losses are that you're feeling and how they affect your everyday life. With depression, it's constant feelings of doom and sadness and despair. That's a little bit, it doesn't go away, is a big difference there. Grief impacts your life forever, but in some ways, the feelings are temporary. And it is very easy for grief to go to depression. And you can be grieving and feeling depressed, absolutely. But if you do get to that point where you're feeling kind of constantly sad and doomed, that's when it's probably moved into more of depression, and where you should probably get some services in place so it doesn't become a complicated form of depression or grief. Because complicated grief is even more difficult to deal with. It's very hard to adjust to. It's hard to move on with everyday life, much as depression is. And it mostly happens when someone ignores their feelings, where they fail to grieve, or there's just a lot of other things going on that are contributing to those feelings of sadness, and kind of feeling stuck in the rut. So we've discussed a lot about how loss and grief affects one's life. And then the question becomes, how do we move forward? How do we get through this intense feeling of loss and incorporate it into our life and define a new normal? You don't ever forget, you don't get over it, but you let go and you move on. You bear witness and observe how grief is incorporated in your life, and as you're restructuring your life together. And this can be scary, and it's not easy. And those are the questions that you need to ask yourself. What is it that really scares you about the future and about moving on? And what type of support do you need? Typically, people don't offer help if they don't really want to help. But sometimes it becomes another chore trying to manage all your helpers. Sometimes it's easier to just have those people that are like, call me when you need me to do something, rather than trying to kind of make a chore chart of, well, Sally can help on Tuesdays and Julie will be here on Thursdays. That can become a lot to manage too. It's another thing that you have to manage. But, be aware of what you need and what type of support you need. Because everyone needs those people, that support, that you feel comfortable discussing your feelings and emotions. I know that that's easier said than done, and it kind of depends on the stage as well. In that first crisis stage, I'm sure many people told you Well, you need to take care of yourself. If you can't take care of yourself, you can't take care of your loved one. And that's much easier said than done. People oftentimes feel guilt over taking time for themselves, or there really is simply no time left in the day with everything else that you have going on. And that's understandable. But what's important is to try to incorporate little things as you can. How I mentioned earlier with stress, people tend to get more dehydrated naturally. Take a little step. Just try to drink a glass more of water each day. And that can make a world of difference. And again, easier said than done. How to move towards the gain perspective. How to see the glass as half full rather than half empty. It's really important to identify the growth that you've seen. Recognize that your life has changed. Recognize that things are different. But readjust those expectations and identify the growth that you've seen when you can. Do what you can to provide positive feedback for your loved one. You obviously care deeply for this person that you're caregiving for. You're doing a lot for them, and their wins are your wins. And it's important to verbalize that. Do what you can when you can to try to operate from a strengths perspective. Again, try to readjust those expectations and find little wins in every day. Try to find the silver lining. And I know, again, I'm going to say it, it's easier said than done, but again, start small and it could make a really big difference. The human spirit is incredibly resilient. That is true. It may feel like you're never going to get through the stage of grief that you're in, or that you're never going to get to a new normal, but you will. You'll get there with support and with help. You can find many gains in many unexpected places. And it's important to find a balance. Even if it's a little baby step, or 5 minutes of quiet to yourself, or taking a relaxing bath, whatever it is, in ways that you can take those opportunities and give yourself an opportunity to find a balance. When you become a caregiver, that's a role that you're taking on, but you still have other roles that don't go away, whether it's being a mom or a dad, or being the cook, or your role at your workplace. It's a huge role to take on, a caregiver, and it's not easy to find a balance, but it's one that can make a huge difference in your life, because you still are all those other things. You still are who you were before. You just now have an extra role that you're taking on, and you're trying to figure out how to incorporate that into your life. So again, if you're having trouble finding those gains and counting those wins, try to imagine another time in your life that was a struggle or a hardship, big or small. Think about what caused it and who was involved, who was there to support you, what emotions and feelings did it create, and what was the end result, and how did you make that end result happen. You can use things from past experiences, even if it has nothing to do with caregiving at all. It has nothing to do with a medical issue or an injury. Try to draw those comparisons to be able to use that in your current situation. There's always going to be strains, and there's always going to be difficult days, some more than others. But you can choose to focus on those, or you can choose to find the wins. You will have difficult days, and you will have days of feeling extra stressed or whatever it is. And that's fine and that's normal. It's just what you decide to do with those, whether you learn from those experiences and try to have them strengthen your relationships, or if you're going to let it really get you down. And when I say gains, when I say wins, I'm talking about anything positive, anything that is a satisfactory result, anything that you may see. Most caregivers do have some sense of gains, some sense of wins. It's just a matter of recognizing them, because it's really easy to overlook those things, especially if it's a difficult time. So regardless of the strings, there are always positives that you can find, whether it's a personal accomplishment, development of new relationships, challenges that you learn new skills from, spiritual growth. There's a lot of different ways that caregiving and this really challenging time in your life can become a positive. The critical part of gains is adaptation, or adaptation, excuse me. Again, trying to think of another time where you had a difficult situation and how you got through that, and how your family got through that, and what was in place to help you get through that. Being a caregiver is usually not something that people choose. It's something that happens out of necessity. Usually family members are the caregivers. And that's, again, a huge role to take on, and it's another role that you're adding to a million other roles that you have already. And you do it because you really care for that person. But it's definitely not easy. Finding the positives really is the hardest part. Trying to resolve the crisis and move forward is natural. You want to fix things, and some things just can't be fixed, and that is really the most difficult part about caregiving, and trying to find those positives. But again, trying to look back on other situations where you were able to get through a rough time. Really look into who you are and who you are with your loved one, and to try to answer those questions. And again, don't be afraid to ask for help. Take baby steps. Again, if you're just drinking an extra glass of water a day, it can really make a huge difference in how you function on a day-to-day basis. Again, most people don't offer help unless they genuinely want to help. And it's hard to ask for help sometimes. But again, just baby steps. And doing your best to find a balance is really important, and utilizing those positive coping skills on those bad days. Because you will have bad days and things will be more stressful at times than others, but trying to reflect on those positives, those gains, those wins. And the most important piece from that is don't ignore your feelings. Many of those feelings, whether it's grief, depression or anxiety, it all stems from grief, and it's all something to be worked through. You have to force yourself to face the pain, because there is no other way around it. You have to go through it, and it's very important to address those issues. And there definitely are supports out there that can help. Some of the things that we can do here at the Brain Injury Alliance is we do have area support groups all around the state that give you an opportunity to go and talk to people who are living it and who really feel similar things that you're feeling. And the same thing with the Brain Injury Support Network. That's a peer mentoring program that we have, that caregivers can be linked with other caregivers and survivors with other survivors, to again offer that support of someone who's going through a similar situation, who can really help you through that. Neuro resource facilitation can also be helpful. We can help find resources, provide educational materials on different topics, just be a support person, and help brainstorm and get through those really troubling times. We also have a new caregiver page with resources on our website. And sorry, I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but I will be sending out the slides, so you will have this information. So that may also be helpful. And I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for questions. If anyone has any questions to put here in the question box or the chat, I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you have about the presentation and about this information. I'm also more than happy to discuss any questions after the fact as well. Again, I will be sending out a certification for attendance along with the slides and a survey. So any of these resources or any specific topics that we didn't hit or you want more information on, I'm more than happy to send that information. And you can also feel free to contact me directly if you have any questions as well. But again, I really wanted to leave ample time for questions, so that is the end of the presentation. Please feel free to type any questions into the question box here or the chat. We don't have any questions yet, but I'll give you a couple minutes to try to put some questions in there. All right. Well, if there aren't any questions, again, feel free to contact me directly. Oh, did just get a couple of questions. Yes, I will be sending, the one question was, will you be sending the PowerPoint? I'd love to share some of this with staff members. Yes, I will be sending out the PowerPoint. So you will have that. And again, my contact information if there's any questions on specific topics or wanting any information on anything else. But yes, we will be sending you the presentation. All right. Well, if there are no other questions, we'll go ahead and conclude the webinar. Again, thank you so much for joining us today. Really do appreciate that. And again, I will be sending out the slides along with a certificate of attendance and a short survey. All right. And this will be also put on our website to be watched again and shared. All right. Well, again, feel free to contact me if questions come up after the fact. Otherwise, have a great day, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us.